guess we started growing in January 2020 with the goal of just kind of selling to restaurants, and that worked for a little bit up until the pandemic started. And then we shifted mostly to grocery stores. I was doing pretty much anything to do to sell mushrooms, home deliveries, just advertising also all over social media, which I'll get into that stuff a lot more in my second presentation about running a mushroom business. But yeah, then we would do farmers markets, and steadily over last winter, things really kind of stabilized a little bit more as things opened up in Vermont, and we've just been crushing it through the spring and summer and into this fall. We did a move last spring, and pretty much we're on our way to growing hopefully around 200 pounds of mushrooms a week, and then possibly buying in some just to kind of meet our chefs' needs. And right now is a great time to be in a small mushroom grower, because it's one of the most centralized industries, and there's a lot of issues going on in Pennsylvania, where it's 60% of our country's mushrooms come from. So small growers are able to kind of bypass a lot of those pressures. And I hear it from my chefs, I hear it from other farmers. It's a good time to be kind of helping to decentralize the industry right now. So you guys came to the right place at the right time. So yeah, I have this presentation I have made up for y'all. So alrighty, should be able to see it all right, I think. Oh. So yeah, we're gonna be talking about cultivating mushrooms commercially. Over here is just some pretty mushrooms I grew a couple summers ago, and there's tons of eye-catching mushrooms. I feel like I got into it because I wanted to share how many amazing different fungi there are out in the world, and I thought that chefs and grocery stores are a great way to get them into kind of people's hands and mouths that might not know about the different flavors that are out there. And now over the past couple of years, it has exploded. Demand keeps growing every single year and it has been for decades for specialty mushrooms in the US. So I think I'm going to start off with just kind of basic bio lesson here. Fungi are extremely unique. So they are more closely related to animals than they are plants, which means they're heterotrophs, which just means that they eat other things to survive, whereas plants would make their own food. Where they differ from animals is that they are osmotrophic, so they digest things outside of their bodies, and they will then absorb the nutrients that they break down. And I'm definitely going to get into some sciencey stuff. I think it's important to just kind of, as a side note, don't need to be an expert in it, but if you're going to grow them, it's good to be kind of intimately versed with them. But obviously, I'm more than happy to field as many questions at the end about this stuff. So I won't go super nerdy with you. So fungi typically found as multicellular masses of filamentous cells. We call them hyphae. The mass would be mycelium, or sometimes single-celled yeast. We're not going to worry too much about those today, even though they are incredibly fascinating and run the world in many ways. So fungi reproduce with spores, either sexually or asexually. And lastly, kind of one of their unique factors is that they have cell walls like plant cells, but they're made of chitin, really difficult to break down, really common naturally occurring polymer. And it's just like a complex carbohydrate that kind of gives them their structure. So the way that fungi move is usually through just colonization. They're only going to be moving through what they're eating. So kind of like, mold moving through your bread, it's leaving its trail of itself pretty much as it moves. And it colonizes the entire thing eventually if it doesn't run into a competitor or something. And then there's two kind of categories of filamentous fungi that are important to know. There's saprotrophs, which are just the ones that decompose things. And then there's mycorrhizals, so they typically have a relationship with plants. That's how they get their nutrients, in addition to decomposition. We're mostly concerned with the ones with that are saprotrophs. They're the ones that are simpler to grow. Mycorrhizals, nobody has really figured out how to grow them indoors just because it's such a complicated relationship they have with plants. Plenty are trying though. And if you figure it out, you'll probably be a millionaire. Basidiomycota is kind of like the major group of fungi that consists of what commercially is grown, kind of like the higher fungi, some people call them. So that includes guild mushrooms like your oysters, shiitake, bud mushrooms, polypores, like your hen of the wood or chicken of the wood, jelly fungi, which are commonly grown in Asia, like you see that in the top right corner. That's like a snow fungus. And then there's some others that we can't really grow, such as boletes or chanterelles. And there's a morel in this picture. They're commonly consumed edible mushroom, but they are ascomycetes. Again, can't really grow too many ascomycetes, so we're not going to be concerned with that. A fascinating thing about mushrooms is that they're pretty much modular organisms in their cell structure. So I think of it as pretty much the mycelium and what's inside the mushroom is the same stuff. It's almost like it's all the same Legos making different shapes. And that'll be important later on as I talk about culturing and making clones of mushrooms. So yeah, generally Basidiomycetes are the ones that farmers are growing, and even more pinpointed is the agaricomycetes, so guild mushrooms, or polypores, which is shelf mushrooms like hen of the wood. So the mushroom life cycle, just bare bones here. We'll start off on the right with the spore. So spores are usually haploid, which means they have like only 1/2 of all the DNA that a mushroom will have in its adulthood. So when it lands on a growth medium, let's say a rotting piece of wood, that spore will then grow into one filament, a hyphal strand, as you see, and that'll kind of expand as mycelium, and it'll only be able to become kind of like adult mycelium once it meets another haploid colony. So they need, and then they connect where you see the mating happens. They become dikaryotic. They essentially, each cell at that point has 2 nuclei. But it's fascinating, but I won't, you don't need to worry about that too much. And then the hyphae will grow throughout their medium. Eventually, when conditions are correct, which I'll go heavily into about how to achieve that, young mushrooms will form. It starts with a mycelium bundle, then it becomes something called primordia, and then the full fruit body or mushroom, and then it starts over. So from culture to harvest, this is just the basic outline of commercial mushroom growing. You start off with a mycelium culture, so either cloning or breeding one from spores. Almost pretty much everything that we grow commercially is from the wild. So there are, records of growing mushrooms for 2,000 years, mostly in Asia. But nowadays, pretty much growers small and large are going outside, taking a mushroom that is edible and cloning it, or taking strains that are already commercially popular, cloning those, and just kind of picking the best phenotypes out, or physical characteristics of their mushrooms, and trying to just pinpoint that. So but as far as domestication goes, they are new to the scene. So then you take your culture, expand that mycelium onto grain. It's kind of your generation 1. Then you can move that onto bulk grain spawn. It's all about just constant exponential growth, and then onto bulk substrate, and then eventually move your bulk substrate that's fully colonized into your fruiting room and grow mushrooms, harvest them, and hopefully sell them. So The fungal lab is an important thing to know about. You don't technically need to have one. You can buy in all your blocks if you want, but for the sake of just education, and you can do everything yourself if you want the most control. And a lot of people I know love to do that. I kind of go somewhere in the middle, do some lab work, but not everything in the lab. So um, when you do any lab work, you are the greatest source of contamination. That's very important to know. I always suggest showering, wearing clean clothes, using disposable equipment and gloves so you can cover yourself in isopropyl alcohol constantly. I use a mask, just even before the pandemic, I was wearing a mask in my lab just because, if you're breathing or like I am singing at the farm, you are producing possible contaminants that will, potentially ruin what you're working on. And I always suggest, if you have lab work on the schedule, do that first. That way you're not playing in the compost pile, getting covered in mold spores, and then going, you're just become another vector for contamination. So the basic lab equipment, this is not my lab, but it's very similar to my original lab and what my current one still is. They all have these stainless steel tables. You want as many smooth, easy to clean, easy to sanitize surfaces as possible. You can get those from like kitchen surplus stores or something. That big box in the back, that's called a laminar flow hood, horizontal laminar flow hood to be specific. Sometimes you can get fancy ones from like a university closure sale or something, but surplus sales. I built mine, this person built their own, and pretty much up top, there's a box that probably has a pre-filter on it. Inside the wooden box is a powerful blower. And then that pushes air through this HEPA filter. And through all that filtration, pretty much, it creates a clean, straight or laminar flow. And that will prevent any air that's contaminated coming from above or coming from you from landing on whatever's you're working on the table. And that way it just kind of catches anything before it hits your petri dishes or your grain or whatever it is. This over here is the little green thing. That is an impulse sealer. You use those to seal your bags, just kind of melts the plastic a little bit. As you said, they got scoops, they got isopropyl alcohol, which I've mentioned already a few times. So pretty basic stuff as far as laboratory equipment goes. So cloning, super fascinating. I've done it. I don't do it commercially, but it's fun. It's cool science stuff you get to do. Pretty much, yeah, all gourmet medicinal mushroom cultivars, usually maintained as clonal cultures because kind of like with apples, use cuttings because you need the clonal genetics, because if you just plant the seeds from each apple, you might not get the same thing growing up from it. Same thing with mushrooms. If you just start from spore every time, you might not get the same thing when it grows up. So because of the modularity I mentioned earlier, pretty much in those shiitake in that picture, it looks just kind of like a homogeneous sponge when you tear it in half. And that's because it pretty much is homogeneous. All the cells are the same. It's all the same Legos, like I mentioned before. Maybe it's just differentiated on the skin on the outside and the gills. So pretty much you would clean up a mushroom in front of your flow hood, use some alcohol on the outside, tear it in half, and because it's a living organism, it should be sterile on the inside. You take a clean blade with, scrape a little tissue off of it, put that onto agar or liquid culture, and it should grow in that nutrient media, and eventually you have your starter mycelium culture, and then you kind of just seal it up with some parafilm and let it colonize and onto the next step. But before we get there, with culture, usually you want to expand it beyond just the initial clone. Not only do you want to just let the initial agar plate grow out and then put onto more agar or more liquid culture. You don't want to just do that for expansion purposes. You want to be able to check, oh, was my initial one contaminated or something like that. So, it's all about quality control at that point. So, I'm mentioning agar and liquid culture. So what are those? So an agar plate is just kind of almost like a two-dimensional growth surface. So it's a petri dish filled with, often they use malt extract agar. It's just kind of a sugary gelatin-like substance. And things can grow through it, but it will stay solid, kind of like a gel. So, benefits are that, it's a 2D surface. You can easily spot contamination on that, but, it might be a little bit more work to make. So malt extract agar is one recipe. There are plenty of others out there, lots of cool DIY stuff out there. And then there's liquid culture. So much easier to make, especially in bulk. Often it's just sugar or honey water. But you can use minerals in there. Also, same thing, lots of DIY recipes. So it's a three-dimensional medium. So it often is an easier way to grow mycelium. It has more directions to grow. But because it's just kind of floating in liquid, it's harder to see any trouble spots. So often for quality control, you need to take a little sample with a syringe and put on agar anyway, to just double check, make sure that there's nothing, no mold or anything growing in there. So yeah, you always want to ensure a clean culture. And then from cultures, which you can buy those as well, expand them onto grain yourself. Next step is grain spawn. So grain spawn is kind of the step in between a culture and the substrate your mushrooms will actually grow out of. And the reason we use grain is because it's cheaper to make tons of grain than it is to make tons of just culture medium. And it's easy to just buy bulk grain, and it's easy to sterilize it. And then it also is easy to mix into your bulk substrate. And it's easy to see if it's evenly mixed. That's the most important thing. If you just kind of put a syringe of culture in there, you don't really know when you've reached the optimal, homogeneity in there. Both grain, you can see, okay, I made a block and I can see that there's some grain at the bottom, at the top, all around the sides. And each one of those grains provides an inoculation point, and they'll all grow concentrically from there. And lastly, it's easy to store and easy to ship. I have a big chest cooler that I just keep it in, and I get my shipment in every month, and it's pretty simple. So making grain spawn, again, I don't make my own, but it's fairly simple to make it. Typically, you use any whole cereal grain, often millet, rye, oats, or a mixture of them. Some people even use corn or Uncle Ben's rice bags. There's tons of funky DIY stuff out there. So it's usually just grain and water. Some people add gypsum just as an extra mineral to change the pH or something. But yeah, the procedure is fairly simple. You soak your grain in water. And what this does is it hydrates it so they're not hard, easier for mycelium to penetrate them. But you don't want to soak it so long, no more than 24 hours, because you don't want them to start sprouting, because at that point it's alive, and mycelium are going to have to, probably won't even be able to grow on that. So you want to simmer it. After that, some people skip that step, and that continues to soften it, continues to make it accessible to mycelium. And then you drain off the water. You can just put a little screen in your kitchen sink drain or something, pour all the grain right in there, let it drain right off. And after it's not sopping wet at all, you want to scoop into jars, like pressure canning jars, or heat resistant spawn bags, kind of like the one right over here. So, and it has like that zipper filter patch you see running through the middle of it. That just kind of allows some gas exchange, because fungi do need oxygen, and they breathe out carbon dioxide. So that's an important part. So then you put those jars or spawn bags folded up into a pressure cooker. You can use any home pressure cooker, anything, you know, from bare bones to some really fancy stuff out there, and you want to do it for 90 minutes at 250 degrees Fahrenheit at 15 psi. You don't want to do it too long because then the grains start to burst and get mushy, and it just becomes easier to contaminate at that point. Or the nutrients in there might not be as accessible to mycelium. Once it's cooled down, you bring it to your lab. You run your flow hood so you get that sterile air going, and then you either inject liquid culture through a self-healing injection port, which a lot of these bags actually come with, or you would take your piece of colonized agar from plate, slice it up with a clean knife, and place that in. And then spawn generations. So your first grain jar, where you go from culture to grain, is your master, your generation 1 or G1, and then you can go through that exponential expansion from one master grain. You go onto 10 bulk bags of grain, 6-pound bags, and you're getting a lot more bang for your buck that way. And again, grain is cheap, so you can really make a lot of spawn for not a lot of money. And some growers will go further into G3, and then some people will go even further, but generally they lose their vigor. So it's called spawn senescence. I talk a little bit about that here. Pretty much, I don't have the exact science down of like the microbiology of why senescence happens, but pretty much what it means is the mycelium will grow normally, but they might not grow mushrooms. And that will happen just if the genetics start to kind of wear down because you're just pushing it, more nutrients without it actually trying to accomplish what it wants, which is, the mycelium wants to reproduce by growing mushrooms. So beyond just too many transfers, too many generations can also senesce if you store it improperly. I've had that happen plenty of times where you store your grain in your cooler for a couple of months too long. They suggest 1 to 2 months maybe. You might not get as much yield out of that, or you might store it outside of your cooler by accident, and that higher temperature will it's pretty much fighting to keep itself alive because it's getting too warm. So, it stops being able to grow mushrooms at that point. So pretty much lots of funky things happen. You want to keep it, nice and cool, nice and fresh, pretty much. So bulk substrate is the next step. I'm doing all this by myself. So I buy my grain spawn in from a supplier that I know will give me something extremely sterile, high reliability, and I'm willing to pay a little extra money to get a little slightly slimmer margin, because I'm not making it myself, but I have the guarantee that it's going to be done right. So as you can see on that substrate bag, each little tiny white spot that is growing concentrically, and so a lot of these are connecting to larger blotches, that was each individual grain. So all that white stuff is just mycelium growing outwards in all directions. And eventually the bag will all become one mycelium network. And that way all the water and nutrients tied up in that bag can all be directed towards where the mushrooms need to grow out, and you'll get as good of a yield as possible if it's all one colony. So the most common bulk substrate that is used in the industry is colloquially called master's mix. Guy called T.R. Davis, popular on YouTube, really good farmer. He popularized it. I'm not sure if he invented it, but certainly made the name for it. It's a mixture of 50% hardwood sawdust. I just use like fuel pellets, and 50% soybean hulls. I use organic, and I love using the pellets because they're dense. I can fit more in my sterilizer that way because they compact more, and once it cooks and hydrates, it'll become mush anyway. But if you're using powder, you might not, there's more air and stuff, so it might be harder to compact it all. So you get more yield, I think, if it's all pelletized. And also the important part is you want it to be as dry as possible when you start. That way, whatever you hydrate in there to reach your 55 to 65% by weight hydration, because the mushrooms do need a lot of water. What you're adding is all you have in there. If you're getting sawdust for free from your neighbor's pile outside, chances are it has a lot of moisture collected from the air. So you might add what you think you need for 60% hydration in there. 6 pounds of water to 4 pounds of substrate. But there might already be like an extra 10%, 15% water in there, and then too much water. There's a slight chance you'll get a higher yield, but there's also a higher chance of more contamination. And, because mushrooms are 90% water, that's where you might get the more higher yield, but I try not to run the risk too much. So generally 55 to 65% is what I see other farmers doing. And I try to stay in that range. And then you do the substrate mixture in these bags. I use a brand called Unicorn. They pretty much are heat resistant, so you can sterilize it. They have a filter patch in there for gas exchange. The ones I use are oxo-biodegradable. It's kind of a newer technology. Use an additive in the plastic. Essentially makes it so the plastic polymers can break apart easier. And supposedly they'll break down even just from UV or heat, even in the landfill. It's a pretty new, not super well studied, but any chance I can have to do less evil, I think I'll take, and if they're not much more expensive either, so might as well give it a shot. So the sterilization process, once you have your bags filled with hydrated substrate, you fold them up, put them into your sterilizer. And the reason you need to sterilize it, which just compared to pasteurization is a much higher temperature, is because master's mix is packed with nutrients, and pretty much anything that will try to grow in there will be able to outcompete your fungi. So molds and bacteria will definitely grow faster if they get the chance to. So you want to get whatever's in your mixture killed, and then keep it sterile from there on out. So there are lower substrate nutrients you can use, straw or sugar cane, which you'll get. There's not as much nutrients in there, but you also only need to pasteurize it at a lower temperature, and you won't have as many contaminants. So it's kind of trade-offs in both directions. And with me, I have very small space to grow mushrooms in. So I want to be able to maximize yield. So I go the extra step of just using high nutrient substrate and sterilize it a little bit more intensely. So many growers like to opt for atmospheric steam as opposed to pressurized steam in your, like in those pressure cookers for spawn making. So I pretty much use a repurposed 85 gallon stainless steel barrel that I got online. And it keeps, so okay, it has like a false bottom connected to your water, so it keeps a constant level of water with an electric heating element, kind of like a boiler, and that creates steam. And through the programming on it, I'm able to keep it at about 204 degrees, and I do it for 17 hours, including the time to heat up. And I have not much trouble with that. Too little time or too little heat will not kill things off as much, so you run into that issue. Too much will end up caramelizing sugars or otherwise changing the biochemistry of your substrate, potentially making it harder for your mycelium to access the nutrients inside of it. So that's kind of the sweet spot. So there's numerous types of sterilization vessels, depending on your scale, anything from your home pressure cookers to these massive autoclaves that you can find, in Alibaba. Mushroom industry is huge in China, so they really have their technology dialed in. And they do have autoclaves that are smaller that I've seen at other small scale farms. Like I said, I have something very much in the middle, probably closer towards the small end, just 85 gallons. And I can fit about 40 10-pound blocks in there. And I can sometimes squeeze a little bit more. And that's kind of my limiting factor, though. I can only sterilize 2, maybe 3 times a week with my labor capabilities. So, if I really wanted to make more, I'd probably have to get a bigger sterilizer at some point. So, but I think 55 to 85 gallon barrels are a good place to start if you want to be somewhere in the range of 100 to 200 pounds of mushrooms a week. At least that's how my farm has gone. So inoculating your bulk substrate. This is where I'm doing all this at my farm. I'm no longer outsourcing. You are able to outsource fully colonized substrate blocks. I find that the margins really drop at this point, but if you're able to sell enough mushrooms, it can still make sense and you can still make a good profit. So I will take my sterilized substrate blocks into my lab, and I try to let the blocks cool down on a shelf in front of the flow hood. And the reason for that is, they're not sealed up. They naturally vacuum seal just due to the condensation process as they cool down a little bit from the steam. But because it's not a pressurized vessel, they're going to suck in air that's unclean from outside of the sterilizer. So some farmers think that's a potential vector for contamination. I don't really have a whole lot of trouble with it. So, if I did all of a sudden, that would be one of the things I would look for. But, the more sterile your lab is, the better. If you have the capability to, have sterile air just pumped in from the ceiling or something, that's even better, and I have visited farms that do go that far. So then once your blocks are cool to the touch, I usually give it overnight. If you are short on time, you can just wait until it's, maybe less than 100 degrees, probably even less than that, because you won't be able to feel the center of the block, which is typically even hotter. So, I wait until it's cooled down fully. So you open the bag up right in front of your flow hood. You have to break it apart, kind of use a little bit of brute force. Sometimes I smack it down on the steel table, or use my fist just to kind of break it apart. I do actually wear a wrist brace at this point because I was kind of doing it with poor technique and bending my hand back a little bit too much, and it wears down on you after like years of doing it hundreds of times a week. So you want to take care of your body. You want to make sure you do it the right way. So after it's broken apart, you put your grain spawn in. You can use a scoop. I think it's another vector for contamination, another thing to clean. So, I'm willing to accept a more eyeballed estimated amount of spawn going into my bag than I am willing to accept a lost bag due to some contamination from the scoop. So I put about 1/3 of a pound of spawn into each 10-pound block. Which, we kind of call them blocks at this point once they've been sterilized, because they just kind of take that shape. And that amount of spawn, it gives me, about a 10 to 14 day colonization time with oyster mushrooms, a little bit longer with some other species. But, it's kind of, it's that sweet spot of efficiency pretty much. And then you seal up the bag with your impulse sealer. And then you're able to shake it up, make that spawn, make all the substrate evenly mixed, and then you throw it on a shelf in your incubation. So your incubation chamber is pretty much where you see that black shelf to the left has kind of fresher blocks made on it. They're still brown. Maybe there's a little bit of mycelium colonization going on. And the shelf to the right was made maybe like a week before, and the blocks are getting to be almost completely white there, and that indicates full colonization. So yeah, this is pretty much the room where it happens. So it should be typically around 65 to 68 degrees. Anything 70 or higher will really kind of let bacteria that might have snuck through sterilization or snuck in during inoculation get the upper edge. And I've had a lot of issues with that, so I try to keep my incubation room as cool as possible without slowing down the mycelium growth to the point where I'm no longer on my schedule. So it's pretty much like almost like a 3-week cycle for oyster mushrooms from sterilization to harvest. So, you know, it's important for me to keep everything on schedule. So some folks like to keep a little bit of light on. I've heard some folks using warm colored light for 12 hours a day in their incubation. I typically keep mine dark. A lot of farmers keep it dark because, you know, I guess the logic is that when they're growing in a log in the wild, it's going to be dark, so they don't need the light. You know, and some people run fresh air just to kind of keep, you know, they're making a lot of carbon dioxide because this is pretty much in each block they're decomposing. That is the decomposition process, which creates a lot of heat and a lot of carbon dioxide. So you don't really see it on these shelves because these are older ones. But you know, I always, with my new stuff, make sure there's at least like kind of like a hand's width of like a finger's width of space between each block, and that just allows them to get some airflow, keeps them from getting too hot, because even in the, you know, way after sterilization, you will feel they're warm because they're decomposing. And if they're just touching, they'll be very warm and could possibly even almost give themselves like a heat exhaustion, like they'll kill themselves off or something like that. So yeah, the spawn run will depend on how much spawn is used. Obviously, you'll be spending more money if you're putting more spawn into each block, but you'll get a much faster colonization. If you don't, you put much spawn at all, you run the risk of more contamination happening. Even though you think you're saving money on using less spawn, you might not be because you have to throw out more blocks. So again, it's finding that sweet spot. So I use 1/3 of a pound per 10-pound block. But I've definitely heard of people using less. So after incubation, we go on to the fruiting, which is kind of the more exciting part of everything because you actually see mushrooms grow. The main aspects important to this are humidity, temperature, fresh air exchange, and light. So humidity, that is a picture from today, actually, of my fruiting chamber at kind of the peak of the humidity cycle. So I let it go all the way up to it's somewhere like 88, 87% relative humidity. And then I let it drop down to around 70, mid 70s, let things dry off a little bit. And then the cycle starts again. During initiation, right as you kind of make a cut into your block, it's just usually a small X into the side or a Z I use. At that point, you know, they need a lot of humidity just to kind of, it's kind of like how you see mushrooms pop up right after a storm. You know, they need that initial humidity push. Yeah, so that cycle kind of prevents contamination because it does become dry. And then also you want to make sure that the humidity is kind of fine water droplets. It's not the same thing as wetness. You can't just spritz or hose down your blocks because that's water droplets sitting on mushrooms. That just harbors tons of bacteria. I've seen farmers do that and their mushrooms don't look great. They become yellow and discolored. So I use an ultrasonic mist maker. It pretty much just has these discs that use ultrasonic waves to make very fine particles, and then with fans, I distribute it throughout the room. Some people use nozzles. I have a very low-key setup with just a grow tent, so this works. So you gotta just find what works, right? So temperature-wise, you want 55 to 62 degrees for oyster mushrooms. So right now is the perfect time because it's, you know, I heat things up just a little bit in northern Vermont, and I get up to 55 to 60 degrees easily. Mushrooms grow well. They don't have a lot of contaminants. So I do, I kind of have a fruiting room inside another room. So I have my grow tent inside a small room that I've subdivided in my warehouse. And I have a mini split in there, cooling things off if necessary or heating things up if necessary. And the reason you don't want your AC or anything right in your fruiting room is because mushrooms will make spores. Any fan will get clogged. So you always want spare fans, and it's hard to have a spare mini split. So, you want to have just kind of, you want to separate that. Some people do preconditioning where they make a small little box, have a mini split in there, duct work going from there into their fruiting room, and then that keeps their fruiting room cool. That doesn't really work with a tent because they're not insulated. But if you were to build up your own insulated structures, you can absolutely get away with that. Um, so yeah, you find what's most efficient for you. So we'll see what happens next summer. This is a pretty new setup for me, but pretty much I'm taking the route of cooling the space around my grow room instead of cooling the grow room itself. And then fresh air exchange is extremely important. So this picture is also from today because over the weekend my exhaust fan broke from too much spore overload. And I have a new one in there right now, but the mushrooms become what's called leggy. So their stems get long, and that's pretty much, they're looking for fresh air, because if in the wild they would want to get out of whatever bark or whatever where there's high CO2, so they can get a gust of fresh wind to blow spores around. So it's not super desirable because it's just chewy, stemmy, but it's not necessarily a lost crop either. I can save these by giving them tons of fresh air now and get a nice meaty cap after that. So typically you want less than 1,000 ppm of CO2. You will need a CO2 meter if you don't want to just, read what the mushrooms are telling you by guessing it. I mean, they'll tell you the CO2 is high, but it might be too late by then. So I keep things dialed in with, a little more tech. You can even get CO2 meters connected to your exhaust system. So, and then I have circulation fans that kind of prevent any dead spots from occurring where there's just high CO2 buildup without airflow. CO2 is also denser than fresh air, so as the mushrooms are constantly producing it, it will sink downwards. So I have my exhaust at the lower end of my room, and that sucks all the old CO2 filled air out and will help keep things negatively pressurized. That way spores aren't leaving the room, they're only leaving through the exhaust, they're not leaking through to where I am, because the mushroom spores will definitely fill your warehouse if you let them. So you want negative pressure for sure, and fresh air will just get sucked in through little screens or something you have in your tent, or if you have fresh air intake fans or something. Light, so this is kind of like the primordia I was talking about. That at that point it's almost turning into mushroom pins, like on the right side of the picture, but on the left side I would still say that's primordia. Just kind of really baby mushrooms, so they need a lot of cool colored light during this phase. So I give my fruiting room 12 hours of light. We're usually running at night just because energy is a little bit cheaper. I use LEDs, so it doesn't really matter that much. But they want cool colored light. I use the 5,000 to 6,500 Kelvin range. There's definitely research out there saying that they like blue light. Some people's grow rooms are literally like purple colored because of that. And then, yeah, so pretty much light will just help initiate growth, potentially speed it up, and helps them develop nice colors. They don't need it for anything like photosynthesis, so it's not, you don't need a ton of light, but just enough for them to start the growing process. Sporulation, yeah, it can get bad. That is some circulation fans that I was cleaning out. I go through them real fast. Every couple of months, I just throw new ones in. You can clean them if you want. Yeah, I get a lot of spore buildup. Oyster mushrooms put out spores that are about 2 to 11 microns in size, and they will. Oh, it looks like I copied the wrong thing in there. Well, anyway, it's supposed to say that they put 4 million some mushrooms can put out 4 million spores in 1 hour. So that's a lot of spores, especially when you have hundreds of pounds of mushrooms growing in there. And mushroom workers' lung is a real thing. I've heard of many farmers getting flu-like symptoms from just constantly inhaling mushrooms, mushroom spores. So I always wear a mask whenever I go in there. It's one of those like 3M masks. So you have these P100 series filters. They're rated for very small micron. So they will filter out, and you have to replace them every now and then, but you are protecting your lungs. And I always suggest every single time you step in there, just, by habit, do it, because if you're going to be doing this for years, you just want to prevent any sort of lung issues or, chronic illnesses from occurring. And then, yeah, like I mentioned before, you want to have just negative pressure in your grow room, just so all the spores that are made are sucked out through one little direction, going straight outside. You don't want it leaking out of your grow room into your workspace. So yeah, how things interplay can be complicated a little bit. It's all a big balance. This is where kind of art meets science, I think, because you need to know your warehouse. Every person's space will act differently. So cooler temperatures means that the air can't hold as much humidity. So the humidifier might work longer, might work harder, and you have to keep that in mind. When the exhaust kicks on, or if you might have it on constantly, which I do, humidity is constantly being sucked out. So you want to have not so strong of an exhaust that it's fighting your humidifier too much, or you want to have like a very strong humidifier so that no matter how strong the exhaust is, it'll be able to get up to your high end of humidity, so nothing dries out too much. And yeah, so if you have, that's the same thing with the constant exhaust, and then more humidity or higher temperatures, in the summer especially, will probably tend to give you more contaminants and more pests. My fruit flies are gone right now because things are nice and cool, so that's easy to deal with. So just kind of things to keep in mind. Humidity and higher temps might make mushrooms grow faster, but it will make other things you don't want grow faster too. The optimal time to pick your mushrooms is when the margins of your oyster mushrooms are still curled down. And yeah, I am mostly focusing on oyster mushrooms. They are kind of like the biggest cash crop of specialty mushrooms. So I apologize if you're looking to hear more about some other varieties, but this is just kind of my specialty, oyster mushrooms and lion's mane. But with the blue oysters on the left there, the cap margins are still curled down. Once they curl up to kind of release more spores, the flesh becomes a little less tender, a little less firm, and the shelf life drops, and they don't look quite as pretty. The color goes away. The Phoenix oysters or summer oyster on the right, you can see that happening a little bit where they're starting to curl up or flatten out, but those are still definitely good enough to sell and feel good about it. Here's a video of me doing a harvest. Struggling a little bit. That's about 2 to 3 pounds of oyster mushrooms off of a 10-pound block. And yeah, you kind of just shimmy them and lift them off eventually. Yeah, you kind of get a feel for it so they don't go flying. You store them. I like storing them 35 to 38 degrees. Anything over 45 will just kind of, they're living, and they will also kind of rot or grow fuzzy mycelium, as you see in that bottom picture. Not ideal. So I store it in cardboard because it lets them have a gas exchange. It doesn't dry them out, but it also prevents condensation. Water droplets or excess humidity will cause that fuzzy mycelium to form. And anything you could, this way you can keep them for like 1 to 2 weeks. Anything unsold I usually will dry if it still looks good. If it doesn't look good, it just goes in compost. So dry mushrooms, definitely sometimes I'll have pounds of them building up over like a season, and then a chef will want tons of them and you can get rid of them that way. Definitely not as big of a market for dry mushrooms in the US. People want the fresh, pretty stuff, but some people will go for it for sure. So contaminants, this is kind of the last section is a significant section though. Every mushroom farmer's nightmare. Contaminants are the greatest adversary for sure, because we're constantly just making the conditions for molds as well, you know, undesirable fungi as well as desirable fungi, because of high nutrients, high moisture, high humidity. You know, spores will land and rot, or metabolites might leak off of mushrooms, and that's nutrients for bacteria. So really, it's about prevention. You just want to clean a lot. I do not go into mushroom farming unless you like cleaning or at least tolerate it, like me. I like to use shoe covers when I go into my fruiting room, just kind of minimize how much builds up every week before I can do my weekly clean. In the summer, sometimes you have to clean, you know, a lot more. You know, your humidifier coats. You know, I try to keep fresh air going into that instead of recycling air in the fruiting room. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a sec. Some people will run UV light in their fruiting room as a little short burst. Mushrooms, there are some studies showing that they will make vitamin D from UV light, so it could be even good for them, but it might kill some bacteria. So if you're building something new, I always suggest floor drains so you can actually kind of hose stuff down and pressure wash. You know, use pressure treated or painted wood when you're building stuff in there. So, you know, expect every surface to become dirty in your fruiting room. Just expect that to happen. So, and plan accordingly. And then, so the biggest contaminant that I have had issues with and other farmers struggle with is bacterial blotch. It makes these mushrooms slimy and orange, especially in that kind of center you see. You can generally, if it's dry and not too bad, you can trim it off and, you know, still have good looking mushrooms on, you know, as you can see, the ones on the sides of it, typically caused by Pseudomonas thalassii, other Pseudomonas species as well. It will spread very fast. So some people, as soon as they see it, just toss the whole block out and try to get rid of it, get ahead of it. And generally, I find that the second fruiting, if you just tear it off, as soon as you see it, the second fruiting will be a little bit more resistant to it. That is a little bit anecdotal, but I've heard other farmers say that too. So it's very persistent, really big problem in the warmer months. So, you know, the biggest thing I've noticed is you just want to keep temperatures cooler. 55 degrees, I rarely have any issues with blotch. If it's there, it's not significant. And then also that wet dry cycle I mentioned earlier, not just keeping constant high humidity, not letting water build up on your mushrooms. Some mushroom species are more resistant to it, so you can look for those strains if you have huge issues with it. I keep my water reservoir clean by just having outside air go blow the fog out instead of recycling air, because then spores get in the water, bacteria eat the spores, it becomes a mess really fast. And I rarely have to clean it by just using that fresh air. Yeah, so you just want to circulate things, and you want to also, you know, clean even heavily, more heavily in the summer. Another common contaminant is trichoderma. That is probably going to happen before you go into fruiting. This is a shiitake block over here that you take the plastic off of those when they're in the fruiting room. Mold will grow on them. I know some farmers will just torch it, but you know, on that block, it's a pretty bad issue. You might just want to toss that one out. But yeah, in my case, I will usually see it in my blocks in incubation, and that way at least sealed up, and I just throw it in the dumpster. Don't even have to worry about opening it and potentially leaking more spores into my grow space. This stuff is everywhere, but you know, you can really up your load if you open up a moldy block or something. So bacteria and yeast, pretty common also in the warmer months. Up at the top, you see those lion's mane blocks that have become contaminated after having a very nice spawn run. You see cloudy liquid building up at the bottom of them. And that's just yeasty bacteria, or if it's dark, it might be metabolites indicating that it's using its own immune system to fight it. So I just toss those out. They're gross, and the mushrooms will probably have some nasty fluid on them as well. So yeah, the biggest thing that has helped me Oh, so okay, actually, let me talk about that bottom picture. So the bottom picture shows a block that had otherwise nice mycelium growing through it, um, besides where this close-up is. But on the close-up, you can see it looks wet. It looks like the mycelium's struggling a little bit. And that indicates bacteria has outcompeted the mycelium there. So the biggest thing that helped me prevent that was keeping my incubation at 65 to 68 instead of 70, and giving them a little more fresh air. So it's little things that can really make a difference. And I love not dealing with this stuff because it smells awful. It makes me gag more than anything. And you can tell in your incubation room when it takes over, not just from the splotchy, wet looking substrate, but because it will smell terrible. It's just like bacteria and yeast growing on your substrate. It's gross, and it's gross to get rid of too. So some other miscellaneous pests that I don't have huge trouble with, but some people do, especially in warmer states. Rodents getting into your soy pellets, or even getting into your fruiting room and leaving crap everywhere. It just becomes a health issue at that point. Obviously, there's tons of ways to get rid of rodents. I just have like those little ultrasonic things plugged in that kind of helps repel them. Fungus gnats or fruit flies, those are everywhere. Those are hard to get rid of. Generally, they will not. Fungus gnats might be a little worse for your mushrooms because they actually are attracted to them. Fruit flies might just be attracted to the smell, but it might not be that bad. So I just have fly traps everywhere in my fruiting room and outside. And then the pleasing fungus beetle, it's a cute little bug. There are thousands of different species of them, but usually you can tell because it's small and has that red head. And those are in my compost pile everywhere. So if you go to your compost, you want to make sure you're not getting covered in them and then going into your fruiting room, because they will go live in your mushroom gills, eat them, lay eggs, and you don't want to sell mushrooms that have bugs in them and they're hard to pick out fully. So cool temperatures in your fruiting room will help kind of slow those down if you do get them. Otherwise, you might have to invest in some pesticides, but really prevention is going to be the biggest thing, making sure you're not, making sure your workflow isn't such that you are getting covered in pests and then bringing them into your fruiting room or your lab. So yeah, we're getting towards the end. So there is definitely, there's a learning curve in mushroom growing, as with any new thing. Unfortunately, a lot of it is learned the hard way. That was the case with me. I got into it, by doing stuff at home first and getting a lot of books. There's so many YouTube channels out there nowadays. So it's at this point, I think, compared to what I learned, there's more junk to sift through. But I also was able to get some grants, and that connected me with some mentors. And I think, between self-education, like taking courses or coming to stuff like this, you can really build up a wealth of knowledge. So there's so much DIY stuff in the mushroom world because it's grown as a hobby during the pandemic now, especially. So you can experiment, but I also suggest learning what is the industry standards and not straying too far from what's common. But also, spending maybe a little bit of time experimenting. And then the other nice part is that your crop cycle is very fast compared to, growing, vegetables or raising animals. Your product cycle is really fast. It's about 3 weeks, like I mentioned, for oyster mushrooms. So if you screw something up, it's not the end of the world. You might have to tell your chefs, hey, sorry, I'm out this week, buy some mushrooms in from another farmer. But you can change your approach quite quickly and troubleshoot. And there's quite a big community now to help you do that. So I appreciate everyone's time. Yeah, I'm more than happy to field as many and all questions as possible. So yeah, I don't know how we're going to do this, Catherine, but.
Yeah, I would say if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat, or you can just unmute and ask directly.
Okay, I'm looking at the chat.
Yeah, it was a good talk. Thanks for that. Yeah, I got a few questions. I guess to start out, you just said lots of books. I know there's lots of books and YouTube channels out there. Is
Mhm.
there any YouTube channels or books that you would recommend?
Sure. So I think the strongest YouTubers would be Myers Mushrooms, Earth Angel, which is TR Davis, Mossback, Mossy Creek. He has a Facebook group called like the Mossback Syndicate, which you can join. Anybody can join, and it's generally a little bit more focused than some of the other mushroom growing Facebook groups. So that's the Mossback Mushroom Syndicate or something like that. Fresh Cap. Fresh Cap is like very much targeted towards home growers, but is really accessible, and he presents it in a very fun way. And then books. So Organic Mushroom Growing and Mycoremediation by Trad Cotter is a good one. And I can also kind of make a list of all this stuff and have Catherine send it out to. More than happy to do that. There's another one. I mean, so Paul Stamets is a huge name in the mushroom world. He has a classic book that's it's escaping me right now. I think I have it on my shelf somewhere here. 1 second. Yeah, it's called Growing Gourmet Medicinal Mushrooms. You can find it anywhere. So that's a good one. Really, really dense, covers many species, but is a little bit more dated. They don't talk about like stuff like master's mix. It's not quite as it uses kind of more classic substrate ingredients and techniques. So that's kind of my core fundamentals, I'd say.
Okay, cool. How much product do you typically lose then to contamination?
Well, I've heard of some big farmers saying expect to lose up to 10% of your blocks that you make. If you're losing 10% of the mushrooms that you are growing in your fruiting room, I'd say that's pretty bad. So, there are some weeks where I really have to throw out, maybe like a third or half of all the blocks I made. That's very, very rare. I know I messed something up badly, like, stored my spawn incorrectly, or, just had really terrible lab technique for whatever reason. On most weeks, I maybe have 1 or 2 of my 80 blocks not make it and throw those out, which is pretty good, especially in the cooler months. If you keep everything nice and cool, you might go a little slower, maybe not too much, but you are saving yourself a lot of hassle with risk as far as contamination goes.
Okay.
And I guess I'll go even further.
It's pretty negligible. It's pretty small in the fruiting room. You don't lose much.
So yeah, I was gonna say, off of like 1 10-pound block of oyster mushroom, I can expect to get around 2 to 3 pounds of product from that. And from there, I trim a little bit off from, trimming the substrate that comes off with it, just to give the chefs a really nice product. If I have blotch issues, maybe I'm trimming up to half a pound off of that thing. So that at that point, it's going to be heavily dependent on how much your bacteria issues are, or if your humidity is dialed in. So yeah, these days it's hard for me to say what my actual yield is versus my expected yield, but I definitely, when things are dialed in and I expect 120 pounds, I'll get close to that, sometimes more. So, and when I look at my fruiting room and I see I have X amount of blocks, And I usually underestimate how much I'm going to have if everything goes perfectly, just to kind of, save myself from overcommitting to all my chefs, So, and if I end up having more, I try to have a good network of people who I can maybe dump some mushrooms on, or some extra product. So.
All right.
I have a question, Kevin. Could you speak to kind of the labor that you put in on a daily basis and what that looks like and for a farm of your size, and then how you've seen that vary throughout the industry?
Yeah, sure. So I have a little bit of help. I have a part-time friend of mine who, helps me out a few days a week. But I'd say, like, when I was doing things by myself, and this is also going to be very dependent on how much technology you have, how much initial investment you put in to that technology. But making all my blocks by hand, let's say 40 10-pound blocks by hand, and sterilizing them, the very first step of mushroom growing. I'm probably doing that for like a few hours, and then every day I'm going to dedicate maybe like an hour to cleaning and harvesting, and sometimes something breaks or something, and then so that actual sterilization process might only take, let's say, like 2 to 3 hours by yourself, and that's doing it by hand. There's machines where you press a button and it pretty much fills a bag, and you cut it down by a lot. And then the inoculation process takes a little bit longer. So at my most efficient pace, where I'm not just doing a sprint, I'm trying to marathon it. It takes me about 2 to 2.5 minutes to inoculate one block, and at every moment, let's say like I have my bag starting to seal with my impulse sealer after I put spawn into it, I'm getting the next one, and I'm starting to break apart that substrate. So yeah, there's no idle moment during that, and that's just to kind of increase efficiency. So I'd say like inoculating 40 blocks at 2 to 2.5 minutes, plus some extra time to switch strains and rub things with alcohol and clean things up. It usually runs me about 2 to 3 hours as well. And then harvest is usually not super labor intensive, especially if you're willing to trim as you're packing mushrooms rather than when you're harvesting them. So I would say about 4 hours on average of just on the farm labor. Then you get into stuff like running the actual business, which we'll obviously talk about in the next presentation. Like I run a pretty active Instagram account, which has done wonders for the farm. Accounting work, just bookkeeping, and marketing stuff, talking to chefs. Deliveries definitely take unpacking mushrooms, that's like a good day for me, like a 6-hour day at least, without having to do other tasks at the farm. Farmers markets days will usually be starting at 7, come back to the farm around 3 or 4, and then I might have some more farm tasks to do. So it was kind of brutal, but there were times when my farmers market days became a 14-hour day. I've learned to kind of manage my time a little bit better, so I don't pack tons of extra farm labor onto the weekends. But farming is harder than I expected, I guess. I guess nobody says farming is easy, but it definitely has a lot of time challenges and unexpected things that will pop up because you're dealing with living things. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. Thanks for that. And yeah, I'm sure this group is very, very familiar with
Exactly. I'm
those
sure you all
challenges.
are way more familiar with it than me, only having done it for, a few years. So
I guess when looking at that initial investment, are there things that you think maybe, you could skimp on or not worry about spending as much money on, or as opposed to some things where maybe in hindsight, or you'd advise like really getting this, don't go cheap on that, look at that, just for how to best allocate the money for
Yeah,
investment?
yeah, definitely. So if I were to like, apply for another loan or something, like the next thing on my wish list would probably be, it's called a band sealer. So instead of one of those impulse sealers that you clamp down on your bag, you place your bag in it and it slides it. And those are maybe like, I think $6,000 to $8,000 for the ones that will actually fit a 10-pound mushroom bag. And it slides the seal, so it still gives you time to do other labor while that's occurring. But you don't need to make multiple seals. It's a nice thick seal. It won't tear while you're shaking it. So I'm constantly sealing it multiple times just because I know if I don't, I'm gonna have some rips, and then that eats up even more. So that I feel like is a pretty nifty tool to have, but not a necessity. At the bare minimum, what you're going to need is, a grow space, a good humidification system, which is around $300 for just like the ultrasonic mist maker and fans and plastic totes. Lighting is cheap. Lighting is like LEDs, or I just have like one little lamp in the corner at this point. Exhaust fans are less than $100. Maybe with duct work, it'll be up to a little over 100. And then you're gonna have to build your shelving, and you want good shelves. I try to have everything on wheels, and the ones I just buy at the hardware store, those wheels give out easily and you can't really fix them. So I invest in some good shelves which run a few $100s each, and they're easy to replace the parts. The sterilizer, once freight is put in, probably will be $2,000 to $3,000 for one of these kind of custom made ones, which people are making them even on Etsy. But the one I use is Bubba's Barrels. That one was actually Eric Myers from Myers Mushrooms, one of the accounts I mentioned. He helped design it, so it's quite popular in the small scale mushroom growing industry. So, you can build your own sterilizer. There's definitely tutorials on how to do it on YouTube, and it's not pressurized, so you probably won't, really harm yourself if you mess it up. You might, screw up the wiring with like your heating element or something and have to redo it, or, burn out a certain part of it. But there are ways to make your own sterilizer, even with like like kind of like a cattle trough type thing. So, and then lastly, really
So your sterilizer, you said it was like 55 gallons. Is that right? And that
mine is 85 gallons.
85? Okay.
Yeah, I decided to go just a little bit bigger just because I wanted to grow into it, because I wanted it to be able to support the max capacity for my fruiting room, perhaps even larger than my fruiting room. So I wouldn't have to just kind of sell it and find something new. And then, let's say you do outgrow it, you can also buy in blocks from somebody else, pre-made blocks. So that's what I'm going to be doing soon. And then the last piece of equipment, which a friend of mine who runs a much bigger farm, he said was his saving grace, is kind of like an automated bag filler. So it's kind of like a hopper, and you put all the pellets you need in it, and then it's just actuated with like a foot pedal, and it one pedal will drop the dry substrate into your bag, and then another pedal will drop the correct amount of water. And if you're making 100 bags that day, doing it all by hand will be a good 4 hours or something. Doing it with foot pedals is going to drop that into a negligible amount of time. Pretty much, it's much more rapid. You're going to spend more time waiting for the water to hydrate the substrate before you fold the bag than you are going to be actually filling them. So, and those things run around like $8,000 usually, I see. Some people make them out of wood. You can definitely, if you're good at that, you can do that. But yeah, the nice metal ones usually around $8,000.
So you're going from buying your own substrate, making your own blocks, to just buying blocks ready to
go? No, I'm supplementing it. So I am gonna keep doing 2 full sterilizers, where I'm packing my sterilizer with 40 blocks. But because I'm sterilizing on Monday, letting things cool down on Tuesday as I'm putting another batch in the sterilizer, inoculating Wednesday. Then I have to inoculate again, either Thursday or Friday. If I want to have the inoculate weekend long, I'd rather buy in some extra blocks than do a 3rd or 4th sterilizer batch. Sometimes when my grow can orders get really high, like around the holidays, I'll do like a 3rd batch a week, and I just accept, going to be doing a little bit more work. But you can definitely, if you're you can definitely keep your margins pretty good. So it's like the cost comes out about like $8.50 to $10 for a 10-pound block, which let's say you get 2 pounds of mushrooms off at $20. That margin is a little bit slimmer than what it costs me to make a block, which is around $3. So you kind of have to figure out what works for you, depending on how much help you can get in labor, or you got to do those calculations. And because I'm ordering spawn from a big company that can also make blocks, they can ship it all together, all in like a refrigerated truck. So I'm gonna ship it that way. If I was just ordering the blocks when I just started, I would usually drive down halfway to meet another farmer and load my car up with blocks, drive up to the farm, put some in the fruiting room, and put enough for the rest of the month just in my cooler space. So you need a walk-in cooler if you're going to do that as well, ideally. And they won't last much more than a month, so you want to plan accordingly. So I pretty much get a monthly spawn order, and I'm going to add on some blocks, so it's a monthly spawn and ready to fruit block order.
So do you think if somebody's doing high volume, it might make sense to just buy the blocks?
Yes. Yeah, it can absolutely make sense. I think, I know farmers who supplement the other stuff that they grow with mushrooms. They're not just a sole mushroom farm. And they are probably just, buying in their blocks and not worrying about all the extra labor and chance to screw it up just with human error. So, that's definitely doable. You would probably need a good bit of volume to keep your cash flow good. Because, if you're buying in $1,000 worth of blocks every month, and it takes a month to get your checks from what you sell, so you buy in, spend $1,000, you grow out the mushrooms. 2 weeks later you sell the mushrooms, and then 2 weeks after that you might not have the money from those mushrooms yet, but you have to buy another set of blocks. So it kind of becomes like it was a little hard for me to manage starting off just with very limited cash flow. So, you know, having a much smaller cost over my head with just making them myself kind of removed a little bit of that cash flow stress. But again, have a good initial investment that could, but just something to be aware of. And the last thing I'll say on that is something that was suggested to me when I started was you want to focus on every step working backwards. So first focus on being able to frame perfectly. Then you can go to making your blocks and incubating them, and you're learning lab technique perfectly. And then if you'd like, you can learn how to make your own spawn perfectly, and then culture. But starting from the beginning and putting the most amount of labor on yourself and the most amount of chances for your error to occur, if you're trying to make a commercial it, really lead to some stress once like it becomes a financial burden. If you're just doing it as a hobby, which a lot of people do to start off, that's fine. You know, it's okay if you mess up. But if you're doing it for a business, oftentimes buying in blocks and learning how to fruit them the perfect way is a good start. So.
And what do those blocks cost?
It'll vary depending on how much you're paying for shipping and everything. The company I get them from, so I have them shipped from Maine to Vermont. I'm paying around $8.50 for a 110-pound block, and that is before shipping. But the shipping is, you know, I'm not buying more than a pallet, so it's a relatively changing cost. So yeah, about $8.50 to buy a block, around $3.50 or to $4.50 to make one. And obviously it's worth it to get to know local mushroom farmers, because many are open to making blocks for you, even if you're you know, burgeoning competitor. Sometimes farmers are willing to work with each other if they know they're not going to step on each other's toes in the future, or if they're going to become a customer, you know, a block customer for a bigger farmer, because, you know, or maybe one of you can become somebody who produces blocks for another farmer, because the beauty of that is you don't have to worry about fruiting it. You just put the labor into making your blocks, let it sit in your incubation once it's inoculated, and you send them all on their way. You don't have to worry about actually trying mushrooms off of it. That's not your problem at that point. Obviously, you want your customers to have clean blocks, but, you know, that's kind of the beauty of selling grow kits for me is, yes, it adds a customer service aspect to my business, but it's a much quicker turnover and much less labor for me, and I can still get a pretty good margin on them, especially with how popular growing mushrooms at home has become. So.
Well, awesome. I
And
think
a lot of that stuff is going to be covered in the business presentation. Sorry, I interrupted you.
no worries. That's great. Yeah, I think this has been super helpful, and I think a lot of people's gears are turning, and I'm definitely certainly looking forward to the mushroom business part as well. So folks who didn't hear from the email or otherwise, we'll be doing a part 2 with Kevin. So if you didn't get to your question tonight, that'll be happening on December 1st at 6 p.m. Eastern as well. And yeah, I don't know, we have about 2 minutes left. If anyone has any last little questions they want to squeeze in.
I guess just learning mushroom farming and just mushrooms in general. I'm pretty new to mushrooms. So do you have any advice on just the best approach to take? I mean, do you think I should really get into the science of it all to begin with, to learn exactly what's happening? Or do you think it's better to kind of, like you said, work in reverse, understand just kind of the basics of the operation and work backward before I get too much involved with lab work and all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I started growing mushrooms, I decided to take a biology of fungi course at a local university, and in a way kind of give a lot of good context to everything I was doing. And you know, it's like, you know, if you're not breeding your own mushroom strains, you maybe don't need to worry about how fungi have sex. But it could just be interesting. But, you know, as far as like production and making profit off of it, you want to know, I guess, what the mushrooms are doing and why they're doing it. Like the stuff I was saying about, like one example is how the mushrooms will turn their gills up as they age to get more spores out. So, you know, at that point, the mushroom is starting to essentially not be necessary anymore and will rot and become less tender, or, you know, less firm, and it will look worse. And it's important to know the life cycle there, or about the biology where how the atmosphere, you know, the humidity. You know, mushrooms grow when there's you know, a humid push, because it's humidity that forms droplets from spores, and actually just through the action of physics help them eject. And that's why you need a humid grow room, and that's why they'll only initiate mushroom growth in a humid time of the year. And then like the carbon dioxide stuff about they're looking to get litter, they're looking to get out of the bark of a tree where there's fresher air, and that's because they want the spores to catch the wind. So, you know, it's always going to help to know more of the biology, but as far as the most necessary stuff, I'd say pick up some books and you know, learn the basics of all the steps, even if you don't think you're going to do them. But, you know, if you are talking to a supplier, you know what they're talking about, and you know, and they'll feel like you know what you're talking about, you know.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Thanks to all y'all farmers out there for coming. And yeah, I think we're really excited to join in the next session. And this was awesome. This was so informative. So thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it was a good time. It was nice meeting you all.
Thanks,
I'm
Kevin.
looking forward to the next one.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Bye, guys.